don't know.
Okay, so welcome to the International Affairs Speaker Series. I'm John Presnell, Professor of Government here at the college. And I just want to make a few remarks before I introduce our speaker this evening. I want to thank the College of the Mainland Foundation who provided the funding for this. So very important for that.
My pleasure.
And our we already mentioned the International Affairs Speaker Series, including our Department Chair of Social Behavioral Sciences, Shinyu Wakao, and the Educational Technology Services, thank you so much for the streaming here, and Marketing and Communication Department for advertising this. Okay, so what is our topic tonight? How does the Palestinian-Israeli conflict end? And our speaker is Dr. Joshua Landis. Dr. Landis is a professor of and Sandra Mackey Chair in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. So let me hand it over to him, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I want to thank John Presnell, and I want to thank also Steve Sewell, who is evidently watching on YouTube someplace. And I want to thank the entire committee who's taken me out to dinner tonight, and we had a really wonderful time. Unfortunately, they gave me this king-size tequila, the Cadillac tequila. So I have a little pink in my cheeks, but I'm going to follow this topic very carefully. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and to talk about this rather sad situation. There are three things I want to talk about tonight. And that is, first, why did Great Britain in 1917 promise Palestine as a Jewish homeland? Then I want to give you a brief little history of how Palestine has become Israel, and how the Jewish community has become really ensconced in Israel. And thirdly, I want to look at President Biden said we're not going to return to the status quo. We are going to support a two-state solution, which would mean that the Palestinians who live in Palestine under Jewish military occupation will have self-determination in a state of their own in the occupied territories. Is that actually possible? And I'm going to argue and try to show you that I don't think it is possible today, that this is just feel-good language on the part of the President of the United States. And it leaves the international community in America and Israel with a real dilemma on its hands. So let me begin my lecture tonight with this first slide, which is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who a number of months ago spoke at the UN in New York, in which he held up this map of the Middle East. And he was celebrating what he hoped would be successful Abraham Accords, which were an American initiative to have peace and recognition between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and which was, according to the leaders of Hamas, the catalyst for their decision to undertake this brutal attack that killed 1,200 Israelis, a third of which were soldiers, 2/3 of which were civilians, as they broke out through the walls of Gaza and attacked settlements in Israel. He held up this map in the UN, and he has a map of Israel. And of course, there is no designation in that map of Israel of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which the Palestinians believe will be a state for Palestinians in the future. And I've included these two other maps because this is a map that is published by an Israeli company for schools in Israel. And here you have the West Bank, which is this. It's a kidney-shaped area here, which was conquered in 1967, and that the Palestinians' hope will be their homeland, an independent Palestinian state, as well as Gaza Strip, which is right here. You can hardly see the West Bank because it's all shades of green. There is a slightly different shade of green for the West Bank, but you can't really see it. Here you can't see it at all, but this is the way Palestinians look at their map of Palestine, and this is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which Palestinians hope will be a homeland and an independent state where they'll have self-determination and run their own affairs. And those are the two contrasting futures for this territory that are radically different. One controlled by Israel as a Jewish state, one a Palestinian state with no control by Israel. Let us go to our next. So why did Great Britain promise in 1917, after the First World War, promise Palestine to the Jews, the Jewish people, as a Jewish homeland? In the Balfour Declaration, a one-sentence, sort of 5-line declaration made by Lord Balfour, the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, in 1917. If we look at the population figures, in 1850, before the rise of political Zionism, the Jewish population of Palestine was roughly 4%. There were about 20,000 Jews living in Palestine, mostly in Jerusalem. By the First World War, there had already been some Jewish immigration to Palestine, and it was about 10% of the population was Jewish. The other 90% were Palestinian Arabs, both Christians, about 10% Christians, and the other Muslim Palestinians. By 1948, when Israel becomes an independent state, a third of Palestine is Jewish. That's just to give you a sense of the land. Now, this map is a map of Palestine in 1947 when the partition was proclaimed by the UN. And the darker orange parts are where the Jews owned land. And in 1948, the Jews of Palestine owned about 7% of the land. They were a third of the population, but owned 7% of the land. And we're going to see what happens to this later because there's a big war. But the question then is, why did Great Britain promise Palestine to the Jews when it was 10% Jewish? Now, there are a number of reasons, and I'm not going to bore you with all of them. There were strategic reasons, imperial reasons. Britain thought that a Jewish state that it had sponsored on the northern side of the Suez Canal would help them keep control of the Suez Canal for eternity. They also thought that this would help them make it British, Palestine British controlled, because they had promised in the First World War that France would be a condominium and co-own it with them and would manage it with them. And so promoting Zionism was a way to make it all British and get the French out. But there's another reason, and that is that many of the leading statesmen in Great Britain were philo-Semitic, that they liked the Jews, and they had a very low estimation of the Arab population there. And we can see that in Lord Balfour, who pronounces the Balfour Declaration, proclaiming it a Jewish homeland. He says, Zionism is rooted in age-old traditions, in present needs, in future hopes of far profounder importance than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. So here he's saying Zionism, Jewish nationalism, is much more important than the prejudices of the Arab population. And he told his buddy Harold Nicholson that the Jews were the most gifted race that mankind had seen since the Greeks of the 5th century. Clearly, he's got this racial hierarchy, and that colors the way Britons are making their decisions on who should have Palestine. And we can see, even if we go to Winston Churchill, our great hero of the World War II, here is what he says about the Palestinians. He says in 1937, he says, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time." Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the saying, the English saying of dog in the manger, which goes back to old Latin aphorisms about the dog in the manger who is greedy about keeping his control of his bone, really, and he won't share it with anybody. But he's likening the Palestinians to the dog. And of course, he thinks I'm sure he thought he was being very humorous in putting this, because the manger for Christians evokes Jesus Christ. And why would a dog in the manger try to get it all? Why wouldn't he share it with the Christians and the Jews? But he goes on and he says, "I do not admit that a wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more widely worldly wise race has come in and taken their place." Now, as Americans, we can understand this, because European Americans, I'm sure, shared these same attitudes when they came to the Americas and decided it should be ours and not the savages who live here. So I don't want to cast aspersions on the nice British people. I'm being facetious, needless to say. Excuse me. Okay. But these attitudes, racial attitudes, are not gone. They're still with us, I would argue, to a large degree. If we take Theodor Herzl, who is the father of political Zionism, he writes a very important book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in the 1890s. He says that not only should Palestine as a homeland for the Jews, but also as a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So that by making Palestine Jewish, Europe will be creating this rampart between the barbarism of Asia and the civilization of Europe. And he's trying to sell the concept of a Jewish state to the British and other European statesmen by saying this will help you, us European Jews, go there and become the sort of warriors at the gate. But that concept, you can see that it lingers, because Henry Kissinger, our Secretary of State under Nixon and President Ford, when there was an Arab embargo in 1973 of oil, which caused oil prices to go way up. Great for Texas, bad for the rest of the United States. Kissinger got furious, and he threatened Saudi Arabia to take the oil province of Saudi Arabia. But he also said to Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, who records this in his memoirs, and he says on the Arabs and the oil embargo, he says, "It is ridiculous that a civilized world is held up by 8 million savages. Can't we overthrow one of the sheikhs just to show them that we can do it?" The same concept of the savages over there in the Middle East as opposed to the civilized people of the West. More recently, I'll just skip over to here, is Israel's president, who argued to United Nations and to Europeans. He said, in defense of the Gaza war, he said, if it weren't for us fighting the Gazans and Hamas, Europe would be next. Which is the same concept as you see here, which is that we're a rampart between civilized world and the barbarians. So Churchillian worldview may have softened a little bit, but not a lot in certain areas. And I think that's important to why British statesmen would have made this decision in 1917. Now, how do Palestinians look at their own history? This is a map that is often shown by Palestinians when they want to make their pleading for a worldview that they present, which is, this is where Palestinians were before the creation of Israel. The Palestinians owned 93% of the land of Palestine, or it was government owned, and that Jews owned 7%. Then, in 1947, the United Nations, which was created in 1945, right after the end of World War II, and Palestine was ruled by Great Britain from World War I, when Britain conquered it, destroyed the Ottoman Empire, conquered Palestine. It was ruled by Britain until 1948, when the British withdrew. And the British turned over Palestine to the UN at the end of World War II. And they did so primarily because President Truman, who was President of the United States at the end of World War II, promised and made it a plank of his presidential campaign that all the Jews of Europe who had been in displaced people's camps, who were poor refugees in Europe at the end of the Holocaust, could go to Palestine. The British had said, no, we're going to stop, we're going to limit Jewish immigration to 15,000 a year, because there had been constant fighting in Palestine between Arabs who were terrified that they were going to lose their country, and that Jewish immigration from Europe was going to overwhelm them. And so Britain had kept 100,000 soldiers in Palestine in 1939 in order to put down constant fighting between these two communities. It needed those soldiers to fight Hitler in 1939 with the beginning of World War II. So they promised the Arabs, we will keep it a unitary state, Palestine will be unified, and only 15,000 Jews a year could come from Europe, which of course infuriated Jews because they were being killed, massacred in Europe by Hitler, and they had no place to go. America was not letting them in at this time because we had closed our doors, and the British weren't letting them in. So President Truman said, no, they can all go to Palestine. But the British thought, oh God, if they all come to Palestine, it's going to be civil war, the Palestinians are going to go berserk, and we don't want to take care of it. So if America's going to make the foreign policy for Palestine, let's just give it to the UN. There's a gift to President Truman. If he wants to rule Palestine, we'll let him do it through the UN. So they turned it all over to the UN. America immediately sent out a committee. Chief Justice Brandeis was on this committee, and others, to decide what to do with Palestine. And they decided, we're going to divide it in half. And they gave 54% of the land to the Jews, that's the white part, and 45% to the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians were 2/3 of the population and owned 97% of the land, or 93% of the land, excuse me. So the Palestinians were outraged. They said, this is totally unfair. The UN is completely ruled by Europeans. The fox is overseeing the hen house, and we reject this. We're going to go to war. So there was war. The 1948 war led to the defeat of the Arabs very badly by the Zionist forces, who were much better united, had better arms, and destroyed the Palestinian militias. 2/3 of the Palestinians fled or were kicked out of their homes and became refugees in places like Jordan and so forth. Yes?
So during that war, were they backed by the U.S.?
Israel.
Yes.
You know,
You said they were so much better. So
they
what
were
backing
not.
made them better?
They were better because they were united. There was one government, the Palestinians did not have a government because they've been fighting the British administration of Palestine. The British ran it as a colony, and the British had allowed the Jewish agency to form a government under Ben-Gurion. They had a unified government, and they had built the Haganah, Jewish Defense Forces, which were legitimate under the British. Because the British didn't want to defend all the Jewish settlements, so they allowed the Jews to defend their own settlements. So they had built an army. The Palestinians had been fighting against British colonialism and had been suppressed. And in 36 to 39, there had been a Palestinian revolt. It was defeated by Britain, which had moved 100,000 men into the place, and they exiled the leadership and killed about 20,000 of the officers and so forth of the Palestinians. So the Palestinians were scattered. They didn't have a strong sense of Palestinian nationalism because they were still thinking they're part of the Ottoman Empire. They hadn't developed a national ideology the way Jews had done in Europe, where Jews had been suffering from European nationalism, which had been very anti-Semitic, and had formed their own national idea. So that's a long answer to a very good, important question. The Palestinians got beaten badly. America was not sending tons of arms, but in my book, I record how Damascus got bombed by 3 aircraft carriers that Israel had acquired. And now there was supposed to be, at the time, in 48, a ban on any European country or America selling arms. So the government didn't sell Israel arms, but lots of American Jews bought airplanes which were put out at the end of World War II. There were tons of Army Navy stores where you could buy guns and all sorts of stuff, and there were tons of aircraft that were just parked in military bases across America, and you could go in and buy them as a civilian. And so Jewish Americans got donations, and they went and bought airplanes, and they flew them privately to Israel. And Israel acquired a whole bunch of B-50, B-27, whatever the hell they were, and these aircraft carriers, and they began to fly them and bomb Damascus and other places that were helping the Palestinians. And in fact, the military attaché in the embassy in Damascus, his house was bombed. And he was furious, and he wrote all these letters back to Washington saying, why are they flying these aircraft carriers? We're supposed to have an embargo on them. And the American government wrote him, and I record this because I ran across this interesting diplomatic correspondence. And they said, well, it's not the government that's selling them. It's private American citizens, and we're free. So it's legal for the private citizens to sell these airplanes, buy these airplanes and fly them to Israel. So, it was one of those things. At any rate, so from 1949 to 1967, that's the way Israel was. This is Israel from the 1948 borders. Then in 1967, Israel decides to go to war against the Arab countries. Nasser is threatening Israel, but in a preemptive strike, Israel attacks Egypt, blows up its entire air force, and occupies East Jerusalem, the West Bank, that green area, and Gaza Strip, which had been ruled by Egypt. This was ruled by Jordan, but full of Palestinians. So Israel acquires all of this land. And today, because of the Oslo Accords, Palestinians have shrunk to owning just these green spots here. And Israel has acquired, has taken through military means and others, the rest of this territory of the West Bank. And so Palestinians look at this and they say, we have lost our land, and they call it a colonial, imperial occupation, blah, blah, blah. Let's look at what the West Bank looks like today. And this gets us to the argument of why I do not think than a two-state solution. Because according to international law, the Palestinians are supposed to have the West Bank and Gaza as an independent Palestinian state. That's their ambition. In the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, that's what the PLO accepted. They said, we want a two-state solution. We recognize Israel. We want peace, and we will never use violence against Israel. The PLO accepted that. Hamas, the Islamist political party, refused that. And they end up in Gaza, and they reject this. The problem is, the PLO, by accepting this agreement, failed. They failed to deliver to the Palestinian people of the West Bank because they didn't create an independent state in the West Bank. It's continued to be ruled by Israel and military occupation. And so Hamas says, we were right. The PLO is wrong. And the Palestinian Authority that rules the West Bank is a failure, and they've just become agents of Israel, keeping us down while Israel takes more and more of our land. And Hamas says the only way for Palestinians to get self-determination is through war. We have to create enough pressure on Israel and the international community to get the world to side with us and get us a West Bank. And that's really what Gaza war is about in many ways, is can Hamas and the Palestinians put themselves at the center of this and get the international community to support a two-state solution? Or can Israel say, no, these are terrorists, they've attacked us brutally, and we need to deal with them in a very dramatic way and not give them quarter because they are terrorists and they're going to kill Jews as long as they're here. The Oslo Accords that were overseen by President Bush the father and then Clinton in the early 1990s, the Palestinians negotiated with Israel. And they came up with a three-part strategy, which was, first, the Palestinians would get self-rule in these green areas, where there was densely packed Palestinian cities. Then it would move to a stage B, and they would get further autonomy here, and hopefully they would get it to there. But what happened is it got stuck. Palestinians today have self-rule in this area, these green areas. They share rule with Israel, so Israeli military forces and military rule is still important in those green areas. And Israel owns all of this blue area, the sea. So Palestinians feel like they've lost everything except for these little green areas, and even there, it's very tenuous whether they have independence at all, because the Israeli military is there.
Sure.
So this is what has happened in the West Bank. And let me just switch. Here's another map of the West Bank. Over here is a portion of Israel. But here you can see the dark red is where the Palestinians have independent rule with no Israeli troops. The pink is where Israeli troops are also cohabiting with the Palestinian security forces. And then the blue areas are which have been settled with Jewish settlements. Here is some facts. There are about 220 Israeli settlements in the West Bank today. There's a big highway system that goes through the West Bank. You can see better in this previous photo here, the highways go between these pink areas. So the white areas between are where roads and state land has been taken in order for communications between these two. And here is a picture of a highway that's been built. You can see one of these highways where there's a highway, only Israeli license plates and Jews are allowed to go on the highway, or Israeli citizens. The Palestinians cannot drive on those highways. And they have big stone walls on either side so the Palestinians can't attack Jews when they drive through the West Bank to their settlements. So they're very protected, and they're going to settlements throughout the West Bank that have been built in the West Bank, and there are about 700,000 settlers that live in the West Bank amongst about 3 million Palestinians. But 700,000 settlers. 700,000 are about 7 million Jews in Israel altogether, and 700,000 of them, that means 10%, live in the West Bank. So for the Knesset, democratic institution of Israel, to vote for Jewish settlers to leave their settlements from the West Bank is next to impossible. It would be like, if I want to use a crazy analogy to speak to Texans, I would say it'd be like asking European Texans to leave Texas so it could go back to Mexico and return it to Mexico. Congress is never going to do that. It wouldn't happen in 100 years because who believes in it? Nobody, certainly not the white Texans. And that's what you're asking Israelis to do, is to move 10% of their population out of the West Bank, or at least a large proportion of them out of the West Bank. There have been proposals to keep these settlements here, the big settlements that are next to the border, and to do land swaps with other parts of Israel and very complicated things which are not going to happen either. Yes?
You said that's what you're asking. So I'm just curious.
That's what a two-state solution would mean.
Okay.
Nobody's really asking it. I mean, I guess if you're saying it should be a two-state solution, the Palestinians are asking that the settlers should leave and it should be our land, because by international law, that's the way it should be. And this is occupied territory. It's been illegally occupied. Here's a picture of a settlement, for example, in the middle of the West Bank. That's one of 220. They're very nice places. They're subsidized by the Israeli government, blah, blah, blah. And here is the growth of settlers since 1967 to today. Well, this is not today. This is 2018. There's a lot more today. And the growth has been steady. So even during the middle of Oslo, over here in the early 90s, when America was negotiating to create an independent Palestinian state, rather than freezing the growth of settlements, Israel was sending many more people in, whether it was the leftward government or a rightward government. The settlements process has never slowed. So Palestinians have looked at this and thought to themselves, this is not serious. America talks about two-state solution, but it's doing nothing. And Israel talks about a two-state solution, but it's settling. So this is just empty rhetoric to throw some dust in our eyes, but basically it's finished for us. And here are why the two-state solution is foreclosed. And many of these things I've already talked about, but the present Netanyahu government says that annexation is their goal. And that's, they promised their coalition partners when they formed the government, Netanyahu did, that they were going to annex the West Bank. There's never going to be a Palestinian state in Israel. And Netanyahu has promised this to his coalition partners in government. So when America says, when President Biden says there needs to be a two-state solution, he's going against the promises of the Israeli government. It would mean he'd have to get a very different Israeli government that would accept a two-state solution, which there are 240 settlements with 700,000 settlers, 1,000 miles of roads, which are Israeli roads cutting up the West Bank. 60% of all the territory in the West Bank is now owned by Israel and has these settlements and roads on it. Article 49 of the Geneva Convention says that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Now the Geneva Conventions were established at the end of World War II because Hitler had gone into Poland or Czechoslovakia, taken land, moved Germans in, and moved Poles and Jews out. And so the Geneva Conventions and the UN established as their primary law, this should not happen again, and that was basically about World War II. Now, so the Palestinians say, look at international law, this shouldn't be happening, Jewish settlers should not be coming, taking Palestinian land, and settling in this area. Since October 7th, over 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been forced out of their homes. 330 roughly have been killed. And there have been many scores of Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians. And 15 different little communities of Palestinians have been destroyed or moved and chased out of their communities. So more and more land has been acquired by Israel, particularly after October 7th, because there's been this enmity between the two communities, and settlers have seen this as an opportunity where they can go. And the head of the settlement community and the security in the West Bank has handed out machine guns to all the settlers who want them, so they can protect themselves against vigilante potential Palestinian attacks, but they've used those guns in order to muscle Palestinians out of their homes. Yes?
Sorry, everybody, got a lot of questions here.
It's all right, we're going to go to question and answer. I'm almost finished.
Okay, go ahead.
Go for it.
It just looks like what's happening here is the same thing that America did to the Indians.
It does look very similar.
Is it?
It is not very different. Let me just stop that with a caveat and say, what do Israelis say? Israelis say, no, this is not similar to what Americans do. This is not colonialism, it's not imperialism. We are Jews returning to our homeland. This is land that God promised us, land in which the Romans forced us out into the diaspora in the 1st century AD. And this is our land. We were returning to our land, Judea and Samaria. Look at the Bible. We are from here. The Palestinians are not native. They are the foreigners. We are the natives. Our movement is not colonialism. Our movement, you Palestinians call us colonialism and apartheid. Totally false. No comparison. We are a liberation movement who are liberating the Jewish people from 2,000 years of persecution, anti-Semitism, and horrid things like the Holocaust. We have been kicked from here and beyond for the last 2,000 years, and we're not going to take it anymore. We have the only place. We've been ethnically cleansed from Europe. Look at the Jews in the Middle East, anti-Semitism. We have only Palestine. And now even America is becoming anti-Semitic. Look at Harvard. Look at UPenn. Look at Columbia. Anti-Semitism spreading from right around. The Democratic Party, half of it's anti-Semitic now. They're siding with Hamas, and they're anti-Jewish. Where are we going to go? Only to Israel. It's a liberation movement. That would be the counter-argument to the Palestinians who said, no, this is settler colonialism, it's classic European imperialism. They've just taken European Jews who don't belong here, and they've stuck them here because they don't like them. They've solved their Jewish problem by sending them to the Middle East and kicking out Palestinians. Those are two different worldviews that we're contending with here. Okay, I'm going to end up by looking at a few little numbers, which is Palestinians, Jewish Israelis. This is old hat because Jewish Israelis are now about 7 million people, and Palestinians are also about 7 million. There are about 3 million in the West Bank, there are 2.2 million in Gaza, and there are 20% of Israelis that live in the blue part are Palestinians who did not get kicked out in 1948 and turned into refugees, but were able to stay in their homes and so forth. And they have full Israeli citizenship. They're not completely equal, but they have prospered and done pretty well and feel very connected to Israel. They have some bitterness against, especially now that the Gaza war is happening, they see their fellow Palestinians being destroyed, but it's a very complicated rainbow of different sentiments amongst the Palestinians that live in each of these different areas because their experience has been different. But it's the 7 million Palestinians don't have self-determination. Most of them, 5 million of them are under, more than 5 million are under military occupation where they don't have rights and they're losing their land continuously under this sort of settlement process that is eating away at their livelihoods. And that leaves 4 basic possibilities for how this ends. Number 1 is a 2-state solution. Biden and the international community would enforce international law and create a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza where there would be self-determination. I don't think that's going to happen because I don't think anybody's going to force Israeli settlers to leave or the government to change or anything else. There's a 1-state solution in which all of Israel, Palestine, would become 1 state, and it would not be a Jewish state. And this, many liberal Palestinians, when they say Palestine from the river, Jordan River, to the sea, the Mediterranean, should be free. That's a chant that you hear on college campuses in America frequently. Israelis hear that chant and they say that is anti-Semitic because it means the destruction of a Jewish state. Palestinian liberals would say, no, it's not anti-Semitic. It means that we should all be equal in one Palestine that's going to be not Jewish, but it's going to be for all of its citizens. And they appeal to Americans in particular and say, look at America, where you're supposed to be equal. It's not just white Europeans and brown people or black people. You're all Americans who have equal citizenship under the law. And the Constitution says all people are equal. That's what we want. Now, most Israelis don't believe that's really what most Palestinians want. They see this as just a little way to, an insincere way to destroy the Jewish state. Of course, bridging the distrust between Israelis and Palestinians is extraordinarily difficult, particularly when you consider that the average Israeli family is making about almost $50,000 a year, and the average Palestinian GDP per capita is about $3,000. So there's a just tremendous gap between the culture, income, educational opportunities, all the things that we know exist in America, but are much more profounder in Palestine. The other solution is expulsion, and Prime Minister Netanyahu went to France and Britain and to Egypt and asked the Egyptians if they would take the Gazans into Egypt, and that Israel could solve its problem by just getting rid of the Palestinian population, which would be, in some ways, a ideal solution for many Israelis. Many Israelis abjure this and say, no, we need to find a common way, but there are many Israelis who say, look, we're not going to live together, let's not pretend, and we need to have transfer of population. And then there's subjugation and military rule, basically the status quo, where things would just continue as they are. We're going to punish Hamas, kill them all, and teach the Palestinians not to do this again, that it's not worth it, and that they have to find a different outcome for their anti-Semitism. And those are really the 4 possibilities. And I would argue that this is the most likely of the solutions that are on the docket, because I don't think America's really serious about pushing Israel to do much. And Israel's doesn't want it. Israelis don't want it. The two-state solution is not popular amongst Israelis, and polls have shown that. But on that rather desultory note, but I think a realistic note, and I don't want to pretend that there's an easy solution for this, but there's going to be, I would say, more Palestinian violence if there is not a solution which brings a modicum of justice to Palestinians and some kind of self-determination. Because Palestinians, even if Israel could destroy Hamas, which I don't think it will be very successful in doing, but if it could, the next generation of Palestinians are likely to be just as radical, if not more radical, because this is going to teach them a lesson, a bad lesson, that they need to get stronger and that they can't live together. And that there isn't any other solution, that their future is going to be very dark if they just put their heads down and behave. They're going to lose more and more land. And that's what they're worried about, and that's what they argue. And so it's really it's a dilemma for the United States to figure out how to deal with this situation and to not have it blow up American policy in the Middle East, because so much of our policy is built around Israel. And we've been trying to get peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And but we've forgotten the Palestinians, and the Palestinians were determined not to be forgotten. And in a sense, they've ruined American policy of the Abraham Accords, which have been started under President Trump, but taken up by President Biden to try to bring peace between the different Arab countries and Israel, even if there can't be a Palestinian solution. So thank you. Questions? Yes.
Of course.
I got another question.
Yes.
Let me pause for a second. Let's go to somebody else, and I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Can,
Let me just give you this because it'll be easier for everybody.
Can you comment on the role the Golan Heights has in this, kind of as an overall story?
Right. Golan Heights is, I'm going to come back and shift to a different picture, if I may. Okay. I want to go back in time here to, here's the Golan Heights. Golan Heights are this area in the north that was taken from Syria in 1967. The Golan Heights are a mountainous plateau, mountains and a plateau that are high and that come down on a fairly steep incline to Lake Tiberias. And the British, when they divided up the Middle East with the French, were much more powerful than the French at the end of World War I, and they could get most of the water for their mandate, Palestine. So they got Lake Tiberias, and they got the Jordan River, and there are many of the little tributaries to Lake Tiberias come out of the Golan Heights. But in 1967, Israel took the Golan Heights. In the 70s, Prime Minister Begin, who was a right-wing prime minister, annexed the Golan Heights to Israel, and is now part of Israel. And President Trump, most recently, recognized the Golan as Israeli and said Israel can have it. We're not going to stand by international law, which is you can't take this stuff through war. So there are, about 25,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank, on Golan Heights. But Israel has just laid out plans in the last several years to have 100,000 more people go and settle there. Syria still sees this as their land, because of course, by international law, it is their land. And they are enemies of Israel and are still at war with Israel. And they help fund Hezbollah, Shiites in southern Lebanon. Their way of trying to balance Israel is to make alliances with anti-Israel forces. That means Iran, that means Hezbollah, that means Hamas, and the PLO. So they've tried the bandwagon, because they're weak militarily, they've tried the bandwagon with these other groups to create some kind of defensive alliance against Israel. And those are the enemies of America. And America has prescribed all of those forces as terrorist forces. And we help to weaken them. And so that's part of America's foreign policy in the Middle East, which is to weaken those groups and to who are seen as terrorists or enemy countries. But it creates these two different blocs that have sided with Russia and China against Israel, America, so forth. So that's the long answer to your short question. Yes, let's
I'm
start.
wondering about political factions amongst the Palestinians.
Political factions, yes.
Amongst the Palestinians, so you had, years ago you had the PLO, and now it seems, at least with Hamas, we have more kind of Islamist kind of political movement. Is there any sense in which is there factionalism amongst the Palestinians? Like how did something you could say was not strictly speaking Islamist now seems to be predominantly, at least in terms of the kind of ruling voice on it?
There are two major factions amongst the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are very divided, which has been part of their weakness and their inability to negotiate convincingly. Gaza Strip is ruled by Hamas, which is an Islamist political organization which has traditionally been against the creation of Israel and Jewish and Israeli rule within the 48 borders. Now, in 1917, they rewrote their charter, which opened up the possibility of their accepting a two-state solution, but they still express in their charter a sense that Jews are foreigners to this land. And the military leader of Gaza spent 20 years in an Israeli jail. His parents were from Israel up in here, and he thinks he should return to his home and have the right to return to his home in Israel proper. So those are still very lively since. The PLO, which accepted the Oslo Accords and signed them, agreed to negotiate with Israel and accept the borders of 1967 and try to have a two-state solution, and have not been militarily active against Israel for most of this time. There's a few exceptions, but they've accepted Israeli Jewish state. But they've done so begrudgingly, because there are increasing numbers of Palestinians who would like a one-state solution and to everybody belong to a non-Jewish state. America, under George Bush the son, in 2007, demanded that there be free elections in the Palestinian territories. And what happened in those free elections is that Hamas won. And America immediately said, wrong choice. You cannot vote for a terrorist organization. And they annulled the elections. And they built up the PLO with arms, and they trained their soldiers to try to take over the Hamas groups. And they did successfully in the West Bank, and the PLO runs the West Bank today. But they failed in Gaza, and Hamas struck first, arrested all the PLO people, threw them into the clink, and took over Gaza. And hence, Gaza is ruled by Hamas today. There's not been new elections since 2007. And that was America's democracy promotion went wrong in 2007. But it gave you a sense of what the political winds were. Now, since then, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it a plank and has spoken in Knesset numerous times to say we do not want the unification of the Palestinians. It's better for Israel to have Hamas in Gaza. They're a terrorist organization, and as long as Hamas exists, there won't be a Palestinian state, because the Palestinians won't be unified, and we can keep them divided and weak, and the West won't try to butt into our affairs and create a Palestinian state. And he encouraged Qatar to fund Hamas and to keep Gaza lively and send their money to Hezbollah in order to keep, as a strategy, to keep them weak. Which makes sense from an Israeli point of view because it's succeeded. The Palestinians are in total disrepair, and the Israelis constantly point to their leadership, which is failing, and say, look, the Palestinians don't even have a, who are you going to talk to? There is no leadership. There's no unified leadership. So they're dysfunctional, and they are dysfunctional. So that's it is a conundrum that President Biden faces when he tries to say there should be a two-state solution, because then they immediately say, well, who should rule? What's going to happen at the end of this war in Gaza? Who are you going to put into power? If you destroy Hamas, you can't put the PLO, because the PLO is led by Abu Mazen, who's 86 years old, and he's corrupt, and the Palestinians don't even like him. The leadership is a problem. Yes?
Right after October 7th, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said this attack, Hamas attacking Israel, did not happen in a vacuum. What did he mean by it? And what is the role of the United Nations right now? How do they look at the conflict and the 30,000 deaths of civilian Palestinians being killed by the Israelis?
This did not happen in a vacuum. That is a very controversial statement. And he was attacked by Israelis for saying this, because I've gone on many news shows and so forth in which I discuss with Israelis, and Israelis say everything changed on October 7th. This is the beginning of a new reality. We were attacked viciously and brutally, which is true, and we are just defending ourselves against this attack that came out of nowhere. Palestinians say, no, you don't start on October 7th. We have been fighting this war of occupation since the Balfour Declaration, since 1917, and we have been suffering from colonial blah, blah, blah ever since. And this is just because we don't have self-determination, international laws are being ignored, America's on the side of Israel, and we are being picked on. And so this spasm of violence is just the latest. There have been bombardments of Gaza almost every 7 or 8 years in which hundreds of people are killed. This is not, October 7th is nothing new. It may be bigger than the previous episodes, but this is an ongoing problem that is a result of occupation. And Israelis don't accept that explanation. They say, Gaza, we moved out of Gaza in 2007, 6, 7, and that Prime Minister Sharon left Gaza. We built a big wall around it, but the Palestinians can manage themselves, and for attacking us, it's just terrorism. So, by saying this doesn't come out of nowhere. It's a little bit like Malcolm X, who said, when Kennedy was assassinated, he said, the chickens are coming home to roost. And he got just hammered for saying that, because it was, right. was suggesting that somehow he deserved it, right? And I don't know, I think that was about Robert Kennedy. I'm not sure if it was John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy. It was John. But had he said it about Robert Kennedy, who killed Robert Kennedy? Sirhan Sirhan. What was his ethnicity? Palestinian. And he said he did it because America was supporting Israel to take away their land. And he said, why should America get away with this? They don't even know what they're doing. I'm going to kill their presidential candidate. And he did. Of course, it didn't help Palestinians at all. It hurt them. But he did it.
Thank you.
Well, we have the stream or the room till 8. And I guess we can answer a few more questions here for sure.
You had your arm up. Let's go, and then we'll go again with you because we want to be.
Sure. So,
Yeah.
so my question is, right after the Hamas's attack, I've heard that even liberal people in Israel now they're supporting yeah, right. So I was wondering, but at the same time now we are seeing the bombing and a lot of people dying. I imagine Israel people also watching that. So I was wondering, intellectual, especially liberal people or intellectual people in Israel, do you think, are you seeing some public opinions change? Because right after attack, of course, people are upset, right? But it's for a while. So I was wondering, we are seeing a different change, or just keep going and everything, as you said, everything changed. This is new things.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think, Israelis, there is the effect of 9/11 where people want to come together, support their government against what they see as a horrible thing. On the other hand, Israelis are getting more and more divided as they see Palestinians get killed. 70% of all Palestinian houses have been destroyed. All Palestinian universities have been blown up. Mosques, churches, so forth have been destroyed in Gaza. It looks like much more than just trying to get Hamas. It looks like the attempt to destroy Palestinian culture and not let it return to what it was before. And we saw most recently with Chuck Schumer, who came out, the most pro-Israeli congressman who has been real champion of Israel, come out and criticize Netanyahu and say this has got to be...
He's Jewish.
He's Jewish, yes. This has got to be a new government. Netanyahu's got to go. And that caused a firestorm amongst American Jews who split, and many condemned him and others supported him. We saw the same thing at the Oscar ceremony, where the director of the great movie which won an Oscar, which was about the Holocaust, and this German family that lives on the other side of the wall of Auschwitz and is pretending to be all totally normal, even as you see the bodies being burnt on the other side. It's about the banality of evil. And the director made a speech in his acceptance speech in which he said, this isn't only about Auschwitz. This is about violence, inhuman violence anywhere, even in our time. And he was indicating Gaza. And almost the next day, 400 Jewish Hollywood personalities signed a petition saying, you are totally out of line. How could you say this? You're dividing Jews at a time when anti-Semitism has never been higher, and this is a terrible thing. And then since then, there's been letters back and forth, and the newspapers have all been discussing it. But the Jewish community, I think, is very divided, because many of them see this as over, this is hurting Israel. And even President Trump, several days ago, 2 days ago, came out and said to Israeli leaders, you've gone too far. This is a bad look. It's hurting Israel. You need to have peace soon. And because it's hurting America. Because America's defending Israel, we have vetoed 3 different UN efforts to get a truce. We abstained from the last one, but then President Biden said that doesn't have any teeth to it. So he basically undermined the vote, the unanimous vote for a ceasefire by saying it's not obligatory. So America's divided, Jewish community is divided, and it is, everybody is talking about it as we are here today. I've got two more questions. Let me just get both of you to say your questions quickly. Yes.
I'll make it quick.
Yeah.
Fight you for this question.
Yeah.
I'll fight you for it.
Yeah.
So I think her name was Francesca Albanese. She was the UN's kind of doing the investigation. Do you think with her 25-page report citing all this evidence that there is genocide will make any impact in the international community, or will there be any change because of her findings?
Okay, thank you for that question. What's your question? Let me just get it quickly. Let's get the last questions all wrapped up, and I'll see if I can answer them.
I think mine was more of a statement. The world community, and there are terrible things being done on both sides. And the Jews have overstepped their boundaries on a lot of things and committed atrocities that were committed against them in 1948 and before. My grandmother survived Dachau and moved to Palestine after the war because no European countries would take her.
Right, to close immigration.
The US turned around boats of refugees because they didn't want Jewish refugees. Two wrongs don't make a right. But at this point, you have so much distrust that where does it stop? You can't demonize one side without looking at what caused it in the beginning or what the other side is doing. And unfortunately, we get away from that.
Well, that's a very good question. It's a good way to end, I think, this discussion. Let me take your question first and remind me, I've managed to just forget the thrust of your question.
Francesca Albanese.
Francesca Albanese. She's a UN official who's written a very damning report. Israel tends to discount her as an anti-Israeli personality. I don't think her report will make a big difference, but the international community is finding a voice on this issue, and we're hearing it more frequently, and it's making an impact in American domestic politics. We saw the Michigan question about whether Biden would lose Michigan, and many Arab Americans have said we're not going to vote for him, even if it's Trump, who's anti-Islamic, and it would have the Muslim ban. But I think these things make a difference, and there is, world opinion is important to politicians. The question of how do you solve this question, and I think it's very difficult because Israelis have a fear that's a legitimate fear that they could be chased out of Palestine. That there are many Middle Easterners and Arabs who, if you travel around the Middle East, you'll hear many Arabs compare Israel to the Crusades. And they'll say, the Crusades came, they conquered Jerusalem and big hunks of the Middle East up and down the coast, and they stayed for 200 years. But eventually there was a Salah ad-Din who drove them out. Israel is the same thing. It's an expression of European power. Europe grew, it could conquer the Ottoman Empire, put the Muslims under their foot, and decide what to do with Palestine, and send Jews who they didn't want to Palestine. But eventually, the Arabs who are divided, who are tribal, who are weak and poor, are going to get their stuff together, and we're going to drive them out. And many Arabs look to China and Russia and say, America is no longer the ruler of the world that defends Israel. And as it gets weaker, it won't be able to defend it. And we're not going to forget this. Now, most Israelis and most Westerners laugh at this concept and they say, look at the Arabs, they're making peace. Egypt made peace with Israel. Jordan made peace with Israel. UAE has come to terms with Israel. Sudan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia was on the verge of doing it, and it still hasn't withdrawn its constant relations. The UAE has not withdrawn their representatives in Israel. They are keeping the coals, they're keeping their powder dry for after this Palestinian thing dies down, because they want Israel. They want Israel as a counter to Iran. They want Israel because it's a developed country that has computer power and is the startup nation. Israel's a success story in the Middle East, and they want to be partnered with Israel. So there are many people in the Middle East who say this whole Salah ad-Din crusader metaphor is just hogwash. History doesn't repeat itself, it doesn't even rhyme. And Israel's here to stay. But there needs to be a fair shake for the Palestinians. That's what the Saudis and the UAE and so forth will say. The governments. People may be very different attitudes, but those are the two views to end up where there is clearly deep, deep anxiety amongst Israelis who've lived, the Holocaust is what? Less than 100 years ago. 6 million Jews killed. There are 7 million Jews in America, 7 million Jews in Palestine, in Israel, and then there's small Jewish communities scattered around the world, but very small. The Jews have been ethnically cleansed from most of the international community. And many Jews, a friend of mine who lives in Westchester, New York, very wealthy neighborhood, just wrote me the other day and said, my neighbor, who's a very hedge fund manager, multi-millionaire, his son just went to Israel, said, I don't feel safe here in America anymore, and I'm moving with my wife to Israel. And there is a sense, a deep sense amongst, I think, more and more people that the world is not safe. And therefore Israel becomes the only place. And French Jews are leaving France. There are not tons of them, there's 300,000, but there's a whole quarter in Tel Aviv where you can get your croissant, your little French restaurants, and everybody speaks French in their cafes, because they're all French Jews who've moved to Tel Aviv and set up French shops and everything because they don't feel safe. As more and more Arabs and Muslims move to France and Europe, they feel that the country is becoming more anti-Israel. So those sentiments are going to, if people don't feel safe, they're going to do anything to protect themselves. And we've seen that on both Hamas doing that and Israel doing it. And it's very hard to find a path forward where both people will find self-determination and some kind of justice. Thank you very much.